Thank you for that kind introduction. And just let me set up my slides really quick. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and then I'm going to go into full screen. Okay, can I just have confirmation that that's working? Great, I got the thumbs up. Okay, thank you everyone for having me here with you today. I'm going to talk a bit about responsible operations, data science, machine learning, and AI in libraries. As Liam mentioned, I'm speaking to you from Las Vegas. I've done the little temperature toggle here. So this is in a numeric representation that should be familiar to you. Is in Fahrenheit, that would be very cold. But I assure you it is not. We're in our own special regional bake for the next few days here in Las Vegas. And it's not even particular to us. It's for this entire region of the United States. We're all cooking over here. I live in Las Vegas, but I work for an organization called the Center for Research Libraries. It's a nonprofit, an international consortium of research libraries, been around since 1949, located in Chicago, Illinois. So I live in Las Vegas. I work for an organization in Chicago, Illinois. The wonders of the pandemic, or the almost post-pandemic environment. As the Director of Information Systems and Technology Strategy, we're focused on fostering open and equitable access to knowledge. And we pursue that objective in part through efforts like responsible operationalization of technology across the cultural heritage community. And just to put this out there, we welcome opportunities to partner on grants, projects, initiatives, and more. So this focus on responsible operations, responsible use of AI, data science, machine learning. I thought I would just say, at the outset, I think that our community and sort of broader community conversations around how to do this right. We have references to being inclusive, equitable, responsible, fair. And I'm really excited about the potential of that kind of framing. Obviously, I spent over a year of my life developing a community research agenda called Responsible Operations. Unfortunately, I do sense that there are aspects of our cultural heritage community and outside of it in private sector and in government that are not as excited about this particular framing, because I think they tend to render it as sort of a binary, that the folks that are interested in ethics or being inclusive or being fair are meaning to somehow stop progress of technology, as if the two things could be separate. I just wanted to say I think that that's ridiculous, and I don't really see a mutually exclusive relationship there. And I hope that others are not lured by that kind of binary framing either. I saw this quote or tweet yesterday from Ruman Chaudhry, the head of responsible AI at Twitter, who is also the inspiration for responsible operations generally, where she was reflecting on this tension a little bit, where she was talking about really not liking the framing that folks that are interested in ethical approaches to technology or responsible approaches are somehow, anti-technology. I think that, focusing on ethics and framing and equity and positive impacts to disenfranchised communities is really about being more closely aligned with the potential of the technology, and trying to think about how this technology could have the most positive impacts. So this is the kind of camp that I find myself in. I put myself in the Ruman camp, and accordingly, you have responsible operations, which I'll be talking about with you today. This research agenda that I developed during my time at OCLC Research, it was released in December of 2019, just before all the crap hit the fan before the pandemic started. So the research agenda itself, it was developed basically from January to December 2019, released December 2019, and it's been out in the community now for a year and a few months. So not that long. Seems like a long time because we've been in a pandemic for the past year and a half. But this is going to be the focus of my talk today. This research agenda, the activities that led to it, and some recommendations for some things that I think that we could do to responsibly operationalize these algorithmic approaches in libraries. As Liam mentioned, I developed this during my time as a researcher in residence at OCLC Research. The community research agenda that I was developing, it was very much and is a community research agenda. OCLC Research sponsored it. The research agenda itself was not governed or informed by OCLC in any way. It was purely a community research agenda that was synthesizing inputs from community conversations, primarily in research libraries in the United States. And the goal of the research agenda is to help chart a series of paths for responsibly operationalizing data science, machine learning, and AI in libraries. It had an advisory group, again, primarily comprised of representatives from institutions in the United States, academic universities primarily, although some representation from the Library of Congress. And then, I put the sunglass emoji next to Melissa Terrace at the University of Edinburgh, the sole representative from your neck of the woods. But I wanted to call that out. Melissa's awesome. In terms of the landscape group, these were the larger number of people that I was having sort of directed conversations about, eliciting challenges and opportunities from a variety of different perspectives. So disciplinary scholars like Ruth Honert at Queen Mary University of London, historians, librarians, archivists, museum folks, technologists working in open science outside of the library community, I should say adjacent to the library community. Lots of diverse inputs. So it was a year of activity, about 60 hours of interviews, one face-to-face event, 3 conferences, which resulted in 144 challenges, 150 comments, and 7 different drafts of what would ultimately come a research agenda. As I said before, in terms of the scoping, almost entirely focused on needs expressed by practitioners and disciplinary folks in the United States. So that is a limitation of this work. I would like to see it expand in the future. Today, this is not going to be like me getting really excited about big data or talking about engineering challenges around GPUs. I'm not really interested in that for this conversation. And you're not going to really hear me get super excited about, oh, I can't wait to scale this and we're going to scale that. I also don't think that that's super interesting. What I'm more interested in is responsible operations framing. I think that one of the few advantages, I guess, that we have in the cultural heritage sector is that the private sector is ahead of us in their use of their technologies. Naturally, they're more well-resourced, but they're also making more mistakes than we are. And the mistakes are pretty egregious, right? So there are lessons to be learned for us in advance of us utilizing some of these technologies if we pay close attention. I think that there is a sense that there may be some progress in the private sector. There was a lot of reporting a couple of years ago, and continues to the present around the development of facial recognition technology, and developments that appear to be positive. So, for example, Amazon shareholders, it went up to vote to stop the provisioning of their facial recognition technology, which was being resold to police departments and for surveillance and things like that. And they placed an embargo on the technology, and there was this great fanfare, like it was this huge win for the the responsible AI community or just like civil rights advocates. But this headline didn't get as much attention, where the facial recognition ban only won 2% of the shareholder vote. Right, that's pretty bad. So, I mean, when I'm thinking about the potential for our community, I'm thinking that we want to focus on being responsible in our use of these technologies, that entails a commitment to fostering individual, organizational, and community capacities for responsible use of these technologies. And again, the hat tip to Raman Chaudhry for the inspiration here. So that basically, as we're considering the good things, I guess if you're interested in scale, how you could scale a description, that we're equally considering the bad things that could happen. And that, really when we're thinking about scale, that, it might be more useful for us to think about going deeper into our relationships, being more vulnerable and empathetic with the communities that we're trying to serve. Why this focus on operations in the responsible operations formula? part of it came to light in these conversations that I had with all these folks in the community in the United States, where among cultural heritage practitioners, there was this sense that of just gratitude to scholars like Sophia Noble and her seminal work, Algorithms of Repression, and also Artificial Intelligence and Weapons of Mass Destruction. There was this gratitude for sort of inculcating a greater conceptual understanding of the potential pitfalls of centering algorithmic methods in provisioning access to information. So there was awareness of that. There was some reflection that in the US, our conferences like the Digital Library Federation are starting to have more and more prominent programming around the socio-technical dimensions of digital libraries and digital collections. But there was a real like hunger to like, okay, I have this conceptual understanding of algorithms of repression, but now how do I operationalize it? How do I look at my staffing, how my organization is set up, what my infrastructure stack looks like, how we approach description? How do I get to operationalizing? So that's why we have this sort of little switch from getting from concept to operations, and thus responsible operations. The research agenda itself is not, I'm not a member of IEEE, I'm not an engineer, so it's not a deep sort of dive into very particular technical questions. The agenda itself is focused more on sort of the fundamental questions that are of interest to cultural heritage community. And like most things, I started out as a digital humanities librarian. And if I think back to, when you do sort of consultation with, say, a historian or something like that, there can often be like this preoccupation, an anxiety-ridden preoccupation with, well, I don't know, I think I want to do text mining, and I'm not really sure if maybe I want to do this thing called modeling the topic or topic modeling. And I just don't know. And then it's, in those interactions, I was like, wait, let's hold on. The method is one thing, but really the question is the thing that we should be centering. Let's focus on your question, and then after the fact we can kind of have this dialectical relationship between the question that brings you to have a meeting with me in the first place, and then have a discussion about the methods. That's a more productive way to go. And so I took that experience and I kind of replicated it in the context of the development of this research agenda, where it's like the primary focus is on what are the primary challenges, the primary questions that our community has. And then following that, the various algorithmic methods that can help us get to where we want to go. So design of the agenda primarily focuses on, as order of operations, questions, then methods. So things like, data science in order to do what, or machine learning in order to do what, or artificial intelligence in order to do what. That's the sort of, normative guiding, or we're talking about shining light, guiding light, I guess, in terms of, orienting the direction of this agenda. And then also really thinking carefully about, well, for who is this algorithmic work for? And then I think fundamentally, by who? Who's going to do it, right? We have all these research agendas coming out. There's this one that I produced. Ryan Cordell produced one, contracted by the Library of Congress. I believe Stephen Cox produced one in England. I might get her name right. Is it Una Murphy? Produced one for the museum sector in the UK. So there's all these agendas coming out saying all the things that we could do, but like, who's going to do it? Who's if we read this agenda, we look at each other in our library, who are the people that are going to do it? Are they resourced to do any of this work? Are there managers apprised of the resources that it may take to do this kind of work? Are funders apprised? Are governments apprised? That's really a question that I try to really anchor myself with, because I think often when we're talking about AI, it's really easy to get swept up into the potential of the work without considering sort of the concrete local realities. And I don't see engaging those realities as like a record scratch at the party. I see it as like that's the thing that you need to do. You need to engage the local reality, and you may not be immediately ready to do some of these things, but the first step is assessing what's possible. And without doing that, you can't do anything cool. Okay, so that's a lot of the kind of staging. There are 7 areas of investigation in this research agenda. There are 18 high-level challenges. And then Subsetted below those 18 challenges, there are 51 discrete recommendations. And I'll just go through this kind of quickly. So the first one is committing to responsible operations. And then we have these sub-challenges around managing bias, committing to transparency, explainability, and accountability, developing generous tools. There's a section on description and discovery where we talk about enhancing description at scale or incorporating uncertain description. Then we have shared methods and data, machine actionable collections, and workforce development, data science services, and sustaining interprofessional and interdisciplinary collaboration. And just a quick riff on that, I got this interprofessional framing from Bethany Novisky over here in the US at James Madison University. And I don't know why I had never seen it before. It's so common when we're thinking, if we work in university context, there's all these centers that talk about interdisciplinary collaboration and interdisciplinary grand challenges and interdisciplinary flows of transnational blah, blah, blah. But it's like, but there's not often, oh, what about us? Like, what about interprofessional relationships, opportunities for librarians and archivists and museums to collaborate together? Or folks who work in technical services and metadata with folks who work in special collections, curators, right? So I wanted to center in this agenda the potential, not just of interdisciplinary collaboration, but collaboration across different sub-communities in the cultural heritage sector. So in the agenda, like most agendas or documents or white papers, position papers, et cetera, there's a table of contents, and then it has sections. And it's really easy to see these things as silos, right? Like, oh, okay, this part is the responsible operations part, committing to responsible operations. It looks like it's about managing bias. That's for the catalogers. And oh, okay, this part over here is about data science services. That's for the librarians that engage more often with professors and students. It's basically like silos. And that's not the intent is not to replicate silos or reinforce silos that we have in our organizations. Really what I'm trying to get at is this notion of interdependency in the design of this agenda. So for example, with something like managing bias in our collections or in our description, it can't be the case that we can manage bias effectively with that responsibility solely falling on catalogers. It's my argument that it has to be the case that that responsibility is shared among the collective knowledge across different parts of the libraries. So that these challenges are by design or just by recognition of reality, interdependent in nature. So I don't have time to talk about more than 50 different recommendations, and I don't think anyone would want that to happen. So I'm gonna use what I call a path. I'm just gonna select almost like a choose your own adventure. I don't know how many of you have read a choose your own adventure book where you get to the end of one paragraph, it's like turn to page 52 if you want to go down the road, or that's essentially what's going to happen now. So I'm just going to kind of cherry pick from the 50 recommendations and the seven areas of investigation, and suggest kind of a path of different recommendations that I think are interesting. So the first one, 1A, managing bias. The second, shared development and distribution of methods. The third, broadening machine actionable collections. And the fourth, committing to internal talent. Love that last one. Okay, so managing bias. Responsible operations calls for sustained engagement with human biases manifest in training data, machine learning models, and outputs. Bias management activities have precedent and are manifest in collection development, collection description, instruction, research support, and more, right? And if anyone here has ever remediated collection metadata, they probably have this experience every day of all of the legacy of their predecessors' metadata smashing on their face, but hopefully they're able to reassemble the Jenga of that collection description and make it accessible in a meaningful way to their users. Just to talk about this a bit more so the point isn't lost. So this notion of bias management, there are different twists and turns in terms of the conversation around bias in AI or bias in collection description. And sometimes there's the discussion of avoiding bias or eliminating bias. And, in conversation with Nicole Coleman at Stanford Libraries, she introduced me to this idea of like, well, maybe it's more about managing bias. And if we think about it as managing bias, it really sort of anchors cultural heritage competency in pre-existing practice. Because if you think about it as managing bias, libraries are basically in the business of that. When we develop collections, when we describe things, when we decide what to teach, when we decide how to navigate information, we're essentially operationalizing a mode or a way of managing bias. And so I found that to be like a really generative framing because one, I don't necessarily know that it's possible to avoid or eliminate bias because you just introduce a new bias. And so it seems like the more feasible thing is to think about managing it. And if we think about managing it per Nicole, there's ways of seeing our competency and our missteps in many different aspects of cultural heritage work, and that should give us some confidence as we're thinking about managing bias in this new context of algorithmic work. And we're not the only ones that think that, just not Nicole and I, right? So Timnit Gebru, very prominent, and Yoon So Jo, very prominent, Timnit, very prominent responsible or ethical AI researcher at Google, fired by Google quite unfairly in recent months. They wrote this article together trying to reflect, primarily from a computer science perspective, lessons learned from the way that archives approach the development of collections that could inform the collection of sociocultural data to advance machine learning model development. So it's not just Nicole and I thinking this, it's also Timnit and Yoon So Jo, and I think that that's super promising. I think that there are aspects of this article that may not square exactly with how practicing archivists think about their work. But I applaud the interdisciplinary and interprofessional work, right? Like they didn't need to try and write this article to reach over to archives to figure out how we approach development of collections. But so it's not perfect, I don't think, but I think it's a gesture in the right direction, and I think it suggests a bridge for us in our practice. Following point, so managing bias, that's all well and good. I talked about all the precedent and how I think that we're well prepared to manage bias in the context of algorithmic work. But I would say that we can't we can't effectively do this work if our workforces are not diverse, right? So there was this wonderful piece from West, Whitaker, and Crawford in 2019 called Discriminating Systems, Gender, Race, and Power in AI. And they were basically reflecting on how the AI workforce is not diverse and how a lack of diversity, just as a demographic consideration within the profession, inhibits the ability of our ability to lessen the likelihood of discrimination being implemented in an AI system. So I think that the TLDR that Too Long Didn't Read of that is that we can't really effectively manage bias as a monoculture. And if we're thinking about just like even the staffing in our profession, the demographics, the diversity and equity and inclusion, it's not a nice to have. It's actually an imperative. Okay, so just one concrete recommendation out of this. I feel like it would be useful, and the contributors to the research agenda felt like it would be useful to explore the creation of something like a practices exchange that highlights successes as well as notable missteps in cultural heritage use of data science, machine learning, and AI. And that we commit to transparency as a means to work against repeated community mistakes, something that Metcalf, Moss, and Dana Boyd have referred to in the private sector as blinkered isomorphism, right? So why is it the case that when we see these, large companies like Amazon or Microsoft getting in trouble for doing something really egregious, like why does it keep happening? Right? What can we learn from that cultural heritage community? Could something like a practices exchange where we're really open and transparent about the things that work well and the things that don't work well, could that help us? I think it could. Next, shared development and distribution of methods. So in the US at least, I'm starting to see things, or we start to see more examples of libraries using something like computer vision, audiovisual collection, large image collection, and it's like, wow, look at all these, look at all these things. They identified 1 million chairs. And it's like, is that good? Is it bad? Is it kind of good? Is it not good? It's kind of hard to tell. The experimentation is fairly archipelagic, kind of disconnected right now. The venues and mechanisms for refinement are few for these experiments, and without the sort of collective refinement of these experiments, there's a feeling that it really impacts assessment of value, and accordingly broader uptake. Right. So in the US, most of the experimentation that we see tends to be on the part of larger, well-resourced research libraries, say like Stanford University or University of Indiana. And, without a little bit more collective work, it is just honestly harder for smaller, less well-resourced institutions to make the leap into doing the experimental work without a better sense of, okay, I see that X university applied this method, it led to this result, but empirically, like, is it worth it? Is it worth it? So a recommendation would be to develop venues, publication outlets, and funding sources that facilitate the sharing of methods and benchmarks for machine learning and AI in the cultural heritage community. Next recommendation or challenge, broadening machine actionable collections. I think, when we're thinking about the potential of AI and cultural heritage, we're really in what Adrienne Marie Brown would call an imagination battle. And I guess in cultural heritage and beyond, right? So if we look at, say, like the natural language processing community, Emily Bender had this great sort of representation in August of 2019 of just like natural language processing corpora that are available. Overwhelmingly, the resources are skewed toward English, and then a shift into Germanic, and then Romance languages, and then a very steep drop off into Mandarin, Chinese, and Japanese, and then over 7,000 languages that have far fewer resources. So it's like when we think about what might be possible in terms of computational work with collections, it's like how many of our collections are currently being provisioned, or how much of our collections are currently even in a state or are being provisioned for computational work. What in other projects that I would call collections as data. Not a lot, I don't think. Right. And Emily had this nice sort of like pithy reminder that natural language is not a synonym for English, which I love. So recommendation, I would suggest prioritizing the creation of machine actionable collections that speak to the experience of underrepresented communities, and that we inform this work through collaborations with community groups that have ties to collections. And that per community ambit, decisions to not develop a machine actionable collection to support AI or machine learning work are as positive as decisions to develop a machine actionable collection. So this suggests, for many institutions, a departure, maybe something that could be a little bit uncomfortable, but I think it's worthwhile. And particularly, I mean, both aspects of this, but really, we need more materials that speak to the experience of underrepresented communities. Here in the U.S., we have a ton of money that's been allocated to digitizing. What am I going to say that doesn't get me in trouble? Yeah, I don't know what I don't know what I'm going to say, but anyway, I'll just say that I think that we should digitize more things that we are not currently digitizing, make them available, work with those communities to make sure that the work with the collections aligns to what those communities need. Lastly, this challenge around committing to internal talent. So it's not just with AI or machine learning or data science. Prior to that, it may have been digital scholarship, or currently still is digital scholarship. Before that, digital humanities. Before that, maybe digital repositories. We have these like recurrent waves of like an exciting thing in libraries. And one of the ways that library administration tends to respond, and I feel comfortable saying this now because I'm a library administrator now, fairly recently. So I haven't done this yet, but one of the ways we tend to respond is, we see something like AI or data science, and like, we're going to hire a really smart, shining star to come into our organization, and they're going to figure out AI for us, and it's going to be great. But anyone who's ever been hired into that position knows that eventually your little firework of star greatness runs out, and then you collapse like Katy Perry into a crowd, and it's hard to ever be happy again. So that's not really a sustainable organizational model. It's not good for that individual person, and then it's not good for the rest of the organization that continues to just do their normal jobs and periodically get asked to do things that are not part of their jobs. Not super useful. We want to be thinking about a way to commit to internal talent that just doesn't stack additional responsibilities on top of work that people are already being asked to do without relieving them of any of the work that they're currently doing. It's kind of like a time allocation, a resourcing question that I think is super challenging for this work that is here now that we need to deal with. We want to make it possible for possibility to not just be the province of one or two people in our organizations, but we want to empower people throughout our organization to be thinking about the potential of something like AI. I think it's an administrative challenge. It's a collective challenge, right? So this one is, I hate to do it, but I'm gonna say maybe form a working group or maybe a committee or something like that, but with a good charge where someone actually has resources and maybe money and authority. So I'd recommend formation of a working group or multiple working groups to investigate the development of organizational models that avoid silos and support hybridity between core and emerging services, and that these models should encourage natural diversification and or deepening of skills over time. So a couple of next steps. Please read the agenda if you haven't read the agenda. As I said before, there are 7 areas of investigation. There are these 18 challenges and 51 recommendations. I will just say again that I'm new in my role at the Center for Research Libraries. I am very invested in responsible operationalization of technology across our community. As I said before, we're a member organization. We have over 200 members in the US and internationally. And I would welcome opportunities to partner on grants, projects, initiatives, and more. Some additional resources, I'd really recommend reading Ryan Cordell's Machine Learning in Libraries, a report on the state of the field commissioned by the Library of Congress, released in 2020. And also the report out on this experiment, Digital Libraries, Intelligent Data Analytics, and Augmented Description by Liz Lorang and colleagues at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Both fantastic pieces of work. Learned a lot from them, and I think that the community stands to benefit from engaging with their work. And I think that's the end. So I'm happy to take questions now.
Thomas, thank you. Just to kind of let you know, I'm going to do the Q&A. And I just thought that was really entertaining as well, because you also managed to cram in the Smurfs, Katy Perry, Homer, and I think, was it Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit into the talk, which is fantastic. So my name is James Malloy. I'm from UCD Library, University College Dublin. Now I'm, Thomas, just so you know, not directly involved in your area as such. I'm not involved in collections. I'm a college liaison librarian. So I'm hoping some of the people who are our attendees can pop questions into the Q&A, and then we can kind of, run through questions as we go along. And I know, Liam, you might have a couple of questions as well, if you kind of feel like you kind of want to jump in there as well. But just listening to the talk as well, I did watch your talk, I think it was back in late last year in Illinois, you were giving a talk. So,
oh yeah. And
I noticed at the end, they let you do the Q&A as well. So I think that's a tough gig. You had to kind of read through the questions as well, which was a lot of work. So I'll kind of look at the Q&A as we kind of go along.
Right.
But there's a few things that struck me. So, you talked about kind of collaboration and partnerships. Have you had any approaches in terms of kind of European partnerships? on the kind of, I suppose, the back of your kind of your paper, and have you had those kind of requests? And also, I was just kind of interested, where did Melissa Terrace from University of Edinburgh, because that struck me as kind of in that list of universities, how that kind of came about, or do you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of European collaborations, I do have one brewing with British Library, and some colleagues at the Smithsonian and Northeastern University here in the U.S. I can't say a lot about it, currently, because we're in that stage of writing the initial grant.
Okay.
But I will say that part of it is focused on operationalizing what I call decentralized innovation on a university campus. So if I'm thinking about the potential of AI, one of the things that I mentioned in the talk just now is having to engage with local reality, right? So and part of that is thinking about to what extent will a majority of libraries ever be staffed with, I don't know, let's say 2 data scientists. I don't know. I don't know how many, right? And I don't know how quickly that'll happen. But I do know that on a number of university and college campuses, there are departments of computer science, and there are disciplinary scholars in different departments that do computational work. And so I started to think about, to what extent is there an opportunity for the library to capitalize on decentralized innovation across the university campus, and work through the process of operationalizing innovation that's just going to happen as a matter of course in each department en route to tenure. And so we're brewing up kind of a grant to explore that particular opportunity. And if we're successful, we'll have some meetings, likely in London, and maybe not in Las Vegas because it's too hot here, but Chicago as well.
Brilliant. I mean, I appreciate it that I guess there's, and you did say this in your talk as well, there's certain things you can't say as well, and we are recording, and so
Yeah.
we say that as well. There's a couple of questions that have come in. One here's from Anya Lynch, and Anya is also on the LIR committee as well. It's just historically, a lot of our libraries have low levels of staff diversity, and our users are becoming diverse at a much faster rate than our staff. Any recommendations on what we can do while the gap gets bridged? And can technology help with this engagement? Do you want me to go back over there?
No. I mean, I've tried to think of. Well, I I think there's a simple one that's just hire more diverse staff, right? So I think that's maybe like the less administratory response is just hire more diverse staff. It's a really tough challenge, and in the U.S. we don't have it figured out either. We have dismal numbers for let's say racial diversity in our profession here in the United States, and there have been various programs over the years that try and increase diversity in the profession. There is funding allocated to create residencies for librarians of color. There are graduate school fellowships to try and increase representation in libraries. There are even programs that I've served on advisory boards for that try and encourage students of color at the undergraduate level to become interested in a potential career in libraries. And then there are mid-career fellowships, and there are also senior fellowships in the United States to try and work on that particular issue. Really tough, and we don't have it figured out. I just know that it's something that we need to continually work toward.
So do you think there's a responsibility with the iSchools, or with I guess library management and HR as well, to really make a kind of a particular point when it comes to recruitment?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And I think there's, various ways to, approach that. Even just like rethinking the questions that you tend to ask in interviews, rethinking, normative reliance on letters of recommendation, or screening calls, or overly heavy lists of requirements to qualify for management. There's a lot. We all know that there's kind of like a chicken or the egg kind of scenario for some of the management advancement. It's like, you want to be a manager, must have 2 to 3 years of management experience, or 3 to 5 years of management experience. I was like, well, where does that come from? How do you get that
Yeah.
before?
Yeah. Tell
How do
me
you get?
about
How do
it.
you? Right?
I've
We like
definitely.
we Yeah. So I think we just have these kind of jumps that we make people make that are not just equitable generally, and then specifically they impact underrepresented communities in even more damaging ways.
Yeah, I think, maybe in the past the focus is on kind of a gender balance, and
Yeah.
kind of, I suppose, the diversity kind of may have not been a kind of a focus. Certainly in Ireland, that may change. Certainly, as Anya pointed out, the universities and where we work are become a lot more diverse,
Yeah.
which is great. And also we see that in the public schools and so on. It's like my own son, his class is just so diverse, which is fantastic because it's something he's grown up with, something
Yeah.
he didn't necessarily grow up with as well. There's another question here from Siobhan Conroy, and it says, you mentioned bias falling to catalogers. There is an inherent bias recently, even in the tools we use from Library of Congress, headings, and also the Dewey class number structure, apart from the collection development. So it's not, I mean, is it a question or a kind of I guess, pointing something out?
Yeah, I would just say I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a legacy, I guess, and and it's a glaring kind of obviously kind of issue as well. So
Yeah, I think that's like one of those like interesting bridges, right? It may be why Timnit Gebru and Yoon Sojo wrote that article. Why are these computer scientists and a historian going to go write an article about what archives do in collection development description to inform what Google does?
yeah.
Right. And I think part of it is just that, right? That we've had these conversations that don't always go well, right? Like we have some blemishes on historical record in terms of how we've approached description, but we have that conversation, and we have improvement and remediation that is social and technical in nature. And so I think in some ways our conversations in cultural heritage community can sometimes actually be a bit more advanced than they are at a place like Google or Facebook or Twitter. And so I think that should be something that gives us confidence as we're thinking about implementing some of these technologies with our collections.
Yeah. Now, like, just say in this series of talks, we've had a relatively diverse kind of range of speakers. I'm trying to remember who said it. It was either I think it might have been David Putnam who said it, or where he's just said, like, Google and all, these kind of, and Facebook and whatever else, they didn't start off, I think I'm trying to choose my words carefully. I don't know if I use the word evil or corrupt or whatever else, but just in terms of how these companies grew, and they have to kind of make a buck at the end of the day, and they've just gotten so big. And it was interesting to say what you mentioned there about, it's a name I hadn't come across before, but Timnit Gebru, and that he was unfair dismissal, and that also seems indicative of the kind of companies as well, that they've kind of don't necessarily have an accountability, or they've grown at a kind of really fast rate, and I mean,
I think it's I think
maybe
it's go ahead.
Maybe something that for us, like, I find now, I use Google like everyone else, and it's hard to kind of get away from, but Facebook, I've found myself really just not engaging with, and yet I am, because I use Instagram, and I guess you're just kind of caught up, or one way or the other. This is like trying to get around a multinational, and we all buy into it, and at the end of the day,
it's in library world, it would be like the Elsevier vertical, right? It's like you don't want to use, maybe you don't sign the transformative agreement, but you still end up using, was it Mendeley or something like that, right? They still got you somehow. Yeah, I mean the timid thing is tough because I think it's balancing the interests of capital versus the interests of social good, or an aspiration towards equity and positive impacts. And where those kind of run into conflict, you get terrible things like firing Timnit or dismantling your ethical AI team. And I don't think it's necessarily even exclusive to a place like Google, but we can see it potentially in libraries as well. One of the things that, or one of the movements that I found to be really, really interesting is this effort by the, what's it called? The Global Indigenous Data Network, where they have these care principles for that they're pairing to the FAIR data movement. Ooh, I know, it's like coming to me. It's like it's early over here. Sorry. Yeah, so obviously, like, or not obviously, I should never say that as an educator, but the fair data movement, it seems like it has a lot of steam behind it in Europe and also the U.S. The Global Indigenous Data Network came up with these care principles. So if you want to be fair, that you should also care, right? Rhetorically, it's kind of brilliant. And within care, the A stands for authority to control. So it's this notion that indigenous communities, with respect to research data, that you should also be embedding this notion that they retain authority to control data that's produced by or is of value to their particular community. And so I was like trying to play through the implications of that in the context of cultural heritage, and where say in the US, for example, that there's a library that holds a bunch of indigenous data, and they tried to operationalize something like authority to control. Like, what would that look like? Like, if a university had been developing a collection and pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars into it over decades or a century, like, are they going to give the collection back? I don't know. I'm not really sure. Right. So I feel it's like not even universities aren't immune to the pressure of capital either, right? Like, you could have a whole bunch of librarians that are super interested in doing something like that, but like, will the provost or the president be interested in that? I think that's because essentially it's like a capital asset.
Yeah.
Right. I don't like to think of it that way, but I can see how it could be rendered that way. Anyway, that's like a long tangent. You had to deal with me being tired and not remembering acronyms, but here we are.
Not to worry. Well, we do appreciate that it's early in the morning, and
Yeah.
for you. And but I mean, I've another question myself. Then really, around artificial intelligence, and this did come up again also in this series of talks as well. And it's, so I was thinking today about and actually look back on it, which is the film Minority Report, and and how. Now it's coming up to its 20th year nearly, and how, which was what I liked about it, was how they had a go at trying to predict certain things, not, our idea of the future that can also be just way too outlandish and so on. And one of the things is around kind of facial recognition. And this comes into the whole thing about artificial intelligence. And as you said, about being swept up in the potential, and I guess where we as humans can lose that whole area of kind of responsibility and regulation and everything else kind of involved in it, and where it can go beyond kind of things like facial recognition and into emotion detection as well, and used in a very sinister way. And you have to kind of look to the east and to China and to the Uyghur people as well, and this being in the news recently. And I guess my question then is about, we can take a responsibility for our own house, our own kind of dwelling as such in terms of the library world, but do we also have a responsibility to lobby beyond our kind of own world in terms of that responsibility throughout the private sector, government, and beyond, or do we not? I don't know.
Yeah, so you asked about Melissa Terrace. Yeah, why? Well, you had this list of people, and then Melissa Terrace was on here. Could you say more about that? And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, one is if you haven't worked with Melissa before, she's like brilliant and so sharp, and has a background in computer science actually. I know that a lot of people know that because they may see her as a digital humanist and just assume that she's a humanist doing digital things. So she has like the technical background, and then all of the years and experience of high profile national or multinational collaborations. But when I gave a talk on this paper at the University of Edinburgh in the fall of 2019, just before its release, I got through Q&A, and then Melissa raised her hand and said, "Okay, so how do I go to my local legislator and lobby for this?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know." But to the question of lobbying, it hadn't even. I think it exposed like a real gap. I think in most I would argue most cultural heritage practitioners training and a set of responsibilities. In the United States, the lobbying function is largely outsourced, or not outsourced, is performed by the American Library Association. They have offices in Washington D.C. And they lobby, but it's not as often the case that there are lobbying actions beyond that sort of like single point. And then there are just like a whole series of other priorities, because the American Library Association represents, tens of thousands of public libraries in the United States as well. So I think to your question, I would answer yes. I just don't know how to do it. I'll just be honest. I don't know how to lobby. I would love to see more. I'd love to see another white paper that focuses on how we lobby for these things. I do think that over on your side of the pond that there's a more robust approach to centering some of these questions around the ethics of these technologies as a matter of say in the European Union, EU-wide legislation, whereas in the US we don't really have that as much. And I'm sorry to refer to the EU as like the EU, and then
That's okay.
yeah, but
we're all still trying to figure it out ourselves, being European. But
yeah,
I guess, I mean, to some extent, we should be global citizens. We should see ourselves.
Yeah,
but it doesn't
yeah.
really happen.
Yeah, but I see Europe as being ahead in that respect, in terms of like centering some of these challenges as a matter of multinational legislation. I think that's promising, as opposed to like this scenario where in lieu of legislation you have a lot of like it almost feels like neoliberal, like moral entrepreneurship. Like you have like each person trying to do the best at being the most moral, and that it becomes like an individual challenge rather than a systemic sort of challenge, and then you get sort of like this infighting and competition. I don't feel like it's as useful or productive.
Thomas, we've no other questions in the Q&A, so I'm just going to say if people have a question based on anything in the talk, now is that actually we do. As soon as I said that, great, okay. There is another question coming in, and I know Liam, you might want to jump in if you have a question as well. This is from Neve O'Sullivan. Says, yeah, you said you see Europe being ahead of the US in this area. Are there any other countries that are doing well, like Canada? And I suppose you could throw in Australia, New Zealand, or any countries in Asia or South America? No.
Yeah, not to my knowledge. I would love to be educated and have greater sense of hope around other governments getting their act together.
Yes, and I guess something like the pandemic has kind of highlighted for us, that kind of polarization in the world as well, and the kind of inequalities in terms of vaccinations and everything else. Where Europe and countries seem to kind of steam ahead with their own agenda, and only now are we kind of like stock of the rest of the world, and then this is a global pandemic, and the issues you've discussed today are also kind of global as well,
I mean, I think the global dimension, I mean, as I mentioned kind of early on, is that this work was primarily focused on information that was produced via community interaction in the US primarily. I am interested in more of like multinational or sort of global assessment. And I think, like I was saying before, that there have been similar kinds of reports to the one that I produced that have come up. I think it was Stephen Cox maybe in England that produced a report recently. I can follow up with that citation, but just on the comment for like the global scene, and because we're talking about government, one of the things that I don't like as much is this conversation that has like kind of tinges of like xenophobia and honestly kind of like racist disposition towards China. Like like Europe needs to do some fancy thing with AI to compete with China, and it just has like weird regressive tones to it that I don't really support, and I hope other people don't.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Liam, do you have a question at all, or is that
No, just to say thanks, Thomas. That was amazing and really interesting talk. I was really struck by the idea of managing bias and not eliminating bias. I think that's kind of a really constructive way out of a lot of these issues like that, even in our own work. And it occurs to me that there's an element of that falls on us as librarians or archivists, as in terms of educating our users to be, even when they're using our collections, to be aware of bias or